In this lecture, I'm going to talk about gene linkage. I'm going to start talking about this from something that we have already talked about, and we talked about it in the previous video that you watched on all the exceptions. Gene linkage is most often associated with polygenic traits, which are the ones that we talked about in class. Hair color, eye color, height, those types of traits that you exhibit. Polygenic traits are usually linked together. So even though my height or my hair color or my eye color is going to be controlled by several different genes, those genes are usually in the same general area of the chromosome. They're going to be right around each other. They're going to be neighbors if you think of it that way. What this means, linked genes are located on the same chromosome and like this is probably the biggest part of a linked gene is they are very rarely separated. In the picture that you're looking at, this is a linked gene for red hair and freckles. I don't think I've ever met a red-headed person that does not have freckles and vice versa. It is something that is always together. In order for this to happen, these two genes that are going to give you red hair and freckles have to be relatively close to each other because they are very rarely, if ever, separated. Now, separation can occur. So your exception to the rule is when it happens during crossing over, which I hope you remember is something to do with meiosis. When I have my 4 chromosomes line up together, the 2 different homologous pairs, they can swap information between each other. That's about the only time that linked genes are going to be separated, if they are, and it will happen during crossing over in meiosis. What this will do is it creates more genetic diversity, which is a good thing. We like genetic diversity because if we were all the same, one disease could maybe wipe us all out. And then the last thing I want you to take into account with gene linkage is the farther apart 2 genes are on a chromosome, the more likely they can be separated via crossing over. So if the genes are very, very close to each other, it's very unlikely that they would ever get separated. The more distance, the more separation you have, the higher chance you have of getting separated. And that would occur during that crossing over of meiosis. Now, how do they figure all this out? Pretty cool little things, and they're called gene maps. And they are exactly what it says it is. These are maps of chromosomes. They show the relative location of each known gene. Most of our chromosomes roughly have been mapped, and we have a general idea of where our genes are located. Now, there's still a lot we don't know, so if you're really interested in genetics and you want to do something in this field, it still is a very big field to get into. We know a lot, but we don't know everything. In the picture that you're looking at right now, this is a picture of a gene map where I have mapped out my X and my Y chromosomes. I'm showing this map or this picture to you specifically because when you're talking about linked genes, most of the time you're going to be talking about sex-linked genes. That's where most people concentrate the information when it comes to gene linkage. You hear a lot more because you can see their phenotypes a lot easier when it's a sex-linked gene that we're looking at. This is the known genes that can be found on the X and Y chromosomes. Now, to continue with that, the rate at which genes separate and recombine can be used to map the distances between genes. And that's how they create the maps that they do. You study them and you let them recombine and change places, and eventually what you can determine is that distance between genes. If they don't separate very readily, you know they have to be relatively close to each other. Maybe they're neighbors or maybe one house over. If they can get separated, it means they have a fair amount of distance between them and crossing over can occur. Okay, so that's how they come up with these. Just a really quick kind of information thing for that. Like I mentioned with the picture, the biggest focus in genetics when I teach it in class, when I talk about linked genes, is going to be sex-linked genes. And it's just because they're a lot easier to see. That is the sole reason. They're a lot easier to talk about and a lot easier to see when you're doing crosses and also when you're looking at different diseases that can occur from sex-linked genes. Now, first, a little background. What this is, we are talking about genes or traits, you can use those words interchangeably like we have been, located on the sex chromosomes. It's all the ones I'm talking about. If I say sex-linked genes, you better understand that I'm only talking about the X and the Y chromosomes. For females, and this is usually the sign for a female when you're talking about it, she's always going to have the genotype of XX. That's what makes you a girl. For males, their universal symbol is this, and their genotype is always XY. Most sex-linked genes are located on the X chromosome. Does anybody know why? Take a minute and think about that question. Why am I going to find the majority of my genes when I talk about sex-linked genes, when I talk about the sex chromosomes? Why are they located on the X chromosome? What would be a really good reason? Hopefully what you're thinking about is, well, both boys and girls have them. Whether you're male or you're female, you're going to have an X chromosome. So it makes more sense that the majority of my genes are going to be located on that X chromosome because everybody on the planet is going to have an X. Not everybody is going to have a Y. So if I have to have a gene that is vital to survival, and as a girl, I'm not going to get a Y chromosome, I've got to have it all on the X chromosome. It has to be there. Otherwise, there would be some different things going on. And you'll find that with some of the differences between male and female, what makes you a boy is the sum of the stuff that is going to be on the Y chromosome. Thousands of unique, it's a key word right there, unique genes are found on the X chromosome. Only about a dozen genes are unique to the Y chromosome. Even though these two pair up, they are considered to be homologous. Traits on X are not the same as traits on Y. They are very, very unique. In the picture that you're looking at again, I have tons and tons of different traits on my X chromosomes, mainly because every single person on the planet has to have an X. You can't get away from having an X chromosome. However, only maybe half the population, I don't know what the difference is between males and females on the planet, but say half the population has a Y. So I don't have all the same unique traits as I have on the X as the Y. If you have a Y, you're going to have unique traits, and in many ways that makes you a boy and gives you the characteristics of being a boy. Before we get into these, one thing I do want you to remember, organisms should have 2 alleles for every autosome. And remember what that means. That means any other chromosome except my sex chromosomes. But that's not always how it works on the sex chromosomes. And we will get into that more in class when I talk about sex-linked diseases or differences depending on what you receive and how that all works between the sexes. For my females, remember you are going to be XX. You do obey that previous thing where you will have 2 alleles for every single trait. You get 2 copies of the traits because you have 2 X's. What this means for my females is they usually have a backup. You have a safety. You have a backup. My males, on the other hand, remember you are XY, you only get 1 X. So, what you get is what you get. No backups. One last thing to talk about, and then I will leave it here, and we will do examples of different sex-linked genes when you get into class, and we'll talk about how they can affect you between male or female, and we'll talk about those 2 different things. But for my females, one last thing. Say you had 1 dominant allele and 1 recessive allele on your 2 X's. What phenotype would you show? For my males, you have 1 recessive allele on your 1X. What phenotype do you show? I will stop right there. Come with your answers, and I will see you in class.